school, it's like your education is beginning. We just can't keep up this thing where these young guys have all this pressure to just know everything. John Shannon said that, he said, when you go to a hospital, he said, your doctor had to practice underneath another doctor. He said, we got these young guys out here. He said, nobody has helped them. And I agree. But I will say this, going back to Steve Wolfgang's preaching school, if we can say it that way that they were doing that, he did, I think, a good job having, if he calls them interns or whatever, but getting young guys to show the ropes. And because it's like, everything in school is just theory. And it's, depending on who your teacher is, it may not even be great theory.
Well, going forward, Caleb, like drive a little spot here, I was very, very curious about the different ones, seeing much clearer, watching. All of these people aren't in that generation. We actually know what is the problem with David Brown. We know what the problem is with Brown Trail. We know what the problem is with Memphis School of Preaching, the Moundsville School of Preaching in West Virginia, East Tennessee. I know people in all of their histories going all the time.
Well, that about him, there's no doubt that he loved people.
Who can tell you how, what's going on with these guys? I can. Johnny Ramsey supported me personally, and that's Brown Trail at the time. One of the elders there, I still know him. You just moved to Austin, and Jerry Moffitt has been extremely helpful to us, great friend to us, and Jerry Moffitt was in there right before David Brown comes in. Joseph Metter, we're best friends with one of the, was there with Joseph Metter when he went off. Just it's not like, oh, it sounds like a gossip session. No. You want to know why they're fractured and who did what and how all this stuff happened. That is our.
Yeah. I think about knowing it is just avoiding it. Like if I did, then I can start basically mapping out, and this is where I say we're playing chess. Everybody's playing chess, so play better. But if I know this is the stuff that they got into it about, I'm not going to do that. Yeah. Or if I say, no, we needed to do that, then I know how to see it coming. And that's what I'm saying for these young guys. And there's just so much more to know about, like, what's coming down the road. And I'm more concerned about these guys in a local community and their evangelism. Like you said, you start cranking up the evangelism, and the long-time traditional Church of Christ folks start getting mad because you're, bringing in new people. I don't know who these people are.
Yeah.
I want them to know that stuff and be, like, on the lookout for, don't just let them fire you, dude, and you don't have some type of plan at all. Because the only thing that they're getting to think about is, like, one event a year. This is the lectureship, and I heard dudes sitting at the table at Memphis saying, I worked all year on this sermon. That is so sad.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Just that, that you're supposed to be like the crowd preaching on a lectureship, and it takes you a whole year to even do that.
Well, I hate to, after I praised your ego just a moment ago, the last time that I preached in Portland, second to the last time, I preached that lesson.
Right.
And was invited to another lectureship, and they said, you don't even have to do a manuscript, nothing, just come and preach that over here. And it's like, why is that the case? It's because we're involved in so many things, and we're getting to study so many different things.
Right.
And, what are we doing? These people that we're really, we've gone crazy on grace. That was 2014, 13 or 14 when that happened. And so, and two, there's going to be some people that are watching this as a result of seeing John Mark. You may go back and watch this, so tag the two together. Listen, as far as we do, what you've heard about us, well, they're very controversial and all that. I did this, and I don't think with a larger footprint in the sectarian world than any of y'all. They don't know you exist, and it is. Sectarian people know us all over. I mean, you go to somebody say, well, how did I test that? Go to Mesa, Arizona, and go to the largest, it's not going to be the largest congregation, but the most well-known Calvinist, and find out, do you know about these guys? Are they a threat? There's no way, given the way we debate, that James White is ever going to debate Born in Sin with us.
Yeah, Jeremiah Norte didn't just unfriend me on Facebook. He blocked me on Facebook. It's like I don't even interact with him, but he did that. So,
and you can go to Philadelphia and do the same thing.
Right.
Do you know these people? And y'all, you're selling your power, the power of the gospel and the truth. You're selling yourself short while you fool around and mix and mingle with each other at these lectureships.
It is an odd thing. Okay. Good evening, everybody. This is the special edition of What Does the Bible Say? And we are the evening before the Victor Knowles interview is premiering. And so Dad and I are here tonight to give everybody, what it says down at their bottom, a meet and greet for Victor Knowles. And so this is how we've opened up in the past. What does the Bible say? It broadcasts Sunday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night. And typically this is what we would say to our local audience, that we are dedicated to ending religious division with unity based on conformity to the New Testament text, outside of the body of Christ and inside. And then down there at the middle, that's fine. It says extending across the aisle. So when I sat down with Victor, and it's a 2.5 hour interview, similar to the others, I said to Victor, probably a number of people based on our audience would not know who he is. And so we wanted to do a meet and greet tonight. And I want to start out, just let you say some positive things about Victor, because the way that, we're trying very hard to get to the meat of these matters, these interviews. Some people maybe would say I don't press hard enough, but I am trying to get in here and get people's thinking, and they're looking backwards, and I think that helps us look forward. And so we get over there with Victor. How was it?
Victor Knowles, for me, Caleb, my age group, I think there's a lot of people who do know who he is because of the Joplin meetings.
Right.
Hated, despised, and that's pretty much, how they're going to look at the Joplin meetings, because it's like a bunch of liberals went over there to try to hug up to a bunch of Christian church people, and they don't have a clue. And I'm not saying that I was the person who had all that together, but I will say, going into it, I was thrilled to death to get to that level in the Christian church. I don't think, with Don DeWelt being dead, I don't think that there's anyone that is known to us like Victor Knowles would be, aside from Don DeWelt. So, the other individuals that you may call their names tonight, and you will call them their names tomorrow night,
right? They
will be totally unknown.
Yeah, and so that's something that, well, it is interesting that you said it that way, because when I was with Victor, I told him, guys, I exactly said, guys, I went to school with will not know who he is. But then, as you said, you were coming back into everybody's picture in the 80s, and so they were booming with Joplin, Missouri restoration forums. So a lot of people in your age group will know and will remember Victor Knowles. Victor was extremely pleasant, and he's a pleasant man, humble, he's a pleasure to be around. And it wasn't just all about Victor, just come in, taking it very seriously. And I think that he is, in the conversation that he has, he's speaking to the younger men, and we're speaking to some of today's problems. So it was very, very pleasant. But I do want to get people to think about this, and Dad already said the phrase Christian church. So these interviews are very much coming into full circle. We started with Rubel Shelley, and then right after Rubel, it was Alan Hires, and then into Steve Wolfgang. And the way that people would perceive that, as I say full circle, I think some people would say, well, you were full circle once you got Steve Wolfgang in the picture, because it's left, center, right. And if you can get more full circle than full circle.
And you're not talking about that picture.
How do you mean?
Well, when you were telling me that a minute ago, I thought you were trying to get us to focus on who's on the left, who's on the right.
Yeah.
Literally, you're talking.
Wings
Yes.
of the brotherhood. People would say, well, when you interviewed Rubel, that was left wing. And when you interviewed Allen, that was main line, center. And when Caleb went to interview Steve Wolfgang, he went out to the right and got, the non-institutional anti. So that's how people would say full circle. Now, I did have this just, that's Victor towards the end of the interview making quite a funny joke. Everybody has had a pleasant time. And I say that right now. I have talked with some other people, and I'm telling all y'all, these mainline conservatives have said no more than anybody else. And so it is quite odd to me that a collection of folk who would posture themselves as these aggressive, ready to rumble, then are declining to have these intricate discussions. So,
Who said they have anxiety in their genes? Leroy Garrett?
Yeah, Carl said it about Freed-Hardeman Society. When Leroy got arrested in 1955 at Freed-Hardeman, Carl Ketcherside's response was, those people have anxiety in their genes, and his response was, it could only happen to Freed-Hardeman.
So Caleb told me a story the other day, and it's about the Masons, and the surprise from, when you told me as the chief of police, I just about fell out. That guy knows that about you. Tell that.
Which part about him knowing it about me?
No,
the whole thing.
No, later he knows you, but I'm saying that whole thing, how that your interaction was.
Well, I went to the local Masons meeting, which is like the first Monday of the month, and I waited for everybody to come out of the lodge so that I could start asking my questions about Freemasons, and I get a circle of men around me. It's typically how it goes. So I get a circle of men around me. I'm asking them questions about Masons, and one person said, just go check online, you'll get all your answers. And I said, well, I've looked online. And then someone else said, well, you shouldn't trust the stuff you read online. And then I said, well, I read Mason books too. And he said, if somebody put Mason material into print, that's not trustworthy. And I said, well, how do I get answers? Because I came to y'all and nobody wants to answer any questions. So I'm just working this circle. And I said, one thing that I think about y'all is that you're religious people who have to leave your religion at the door to be a Mason. And one guy said, well, what do you mean by that? And I said, where do you go to church? And he said, I'm something or another Baptist. And I knew that the chief of police and the other police officer were both in the Christian church. And then I said, these two don't even think you're saved. And then another bystander said, who taught you how to do this? And I said, what? And he said, this whole conversation, we've gone everywhere that you want to go. And he said, you're pitting everybody out here against each other. And my response was, I said, we're just talking. But it is the case that the chief of police was in the circle.
Okay, that is classic what our brethren do not know how to do. They don't know how to do it with each other. And if they did it, let's say you cornered all those guys of what you did. And you turned them. It's classic Paul turning the Pharisees and Sadducees against each other. You did it. But the difference in one great sense is we do this and then we're still friendly. Like if you've watched me very long.
Yeah, that chief of police, Mason, I still have a very good relationship with.
We both were just in a city council with that guy.
Yeah.
And he's helping us out. So if you've watched What's the Bible Say very much in the way past, a arch nemesis is Mike Penn. I mean, we have talked about Mike Penn and everything Mike Penn does and the money he spent. I saw him in the bank today. Hey, Mike Penn, he was kind of dodging me, but shook my hand and told me what I wanted to know. And it's like, how do you do that? My question is, how do you not? We're not going to be friends with these people. You saw Brian Edwards.
That's what I was fixing to say. Yeah, I saw Brian Edwards outside a Starbucks, and I went up to shake his hand, and then when he saw me, he hand sandwiched, double hand. So very pleasant with Brian. Yeah, and everybody says the phrase, let's disagree without being disagreeable. Well, that's what I'm doing in these interviews, and then some people don't like it, that I'm not being disagreeable. So, I think that everybody that's done an interview has had a good time during the interview. And again, I was doing more research on somebody else, and I found another picture of John Mark Hicks's dad. And, I sent it to him, and I just am able to say, look, more stuff just keeps coming up. I told John Mark, I said, I'm not researching you, just keep popping up. So I think that Victor had a good time. I had a good time with Victor.
Well, here's the thing too, Caleb. When you're looking at the Old Testament, everybody likes Hezekiah sending out the letters to everybody to fight their common enemy or to get together so that they can be Israel again. But they don't want to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, Manasseh and Ephraim, they themselves were at each other, much less Judah and whomever else was involved. But why are we not? I mean, we all know that these people are folk that have a similar origin?
No, and so
we don't.
I don't think that they do.
Boy,
I think, like when I went to see Dean Ashby, and he said, we're not disciples of Christ, and I said, I know that. And he goes, well, I know you know that. He said, but these other people don't. I think if we could ask people what even the disciples of Christ are, they would have no clue. And a great number of people, if you started trying to talk to them about the Church of Christ and the Christian church, I don't think they would know there's a connection.
I'm astounded.
Like,
if somebody said, we're not trying to dumb it down or whatever it is, not serious by saying we're cousins.
Yeah. I don't know that they
even know that what we're talking about.
I think there's a number of young people right now, my age group and younger, that would not even understand the terminology of these are cousins. That's the terminology. People call them erring. They're brothers, but they're brothers in error, and then they didn't really like that, so they started calling them. Well, they're not quite brothers, but they're cousins. So, but here's what I want someone else to think about too, and I'll play a clip in just a moment, not from the interview, but as he was just saying about there is commonality. And there's background, and we have it up on the description box for this discussion tonight. So what you just said, I would ask people watching, have you ever even talked to somebody from the independent Christian churches? And I know right now there would be plenty of people in the independent Christian churches who could be asked, have you ever talked to somebody from the Church of Christ? And like they say, non-instrumental, and no. It's just, we're not going to go there. We're not going to talk to these people, and they're not going to talk to us. So, but here's another line when I said full circle. Left wing, center wing, right wing. Well, now this is what somebody will say about this. They'll say, well, Rubble is the left, but somebody like Victor Knowles, he's the left. And then when you start talking in those terms, that's where I say it's getting a bit ridiculous, isn't it? To say left, center, right, left, and we could actually do this and introduce a whole nother interview to someone who's beyond the right of Steve Wolfgang. So then you start talking about, well, in the brotherhood, we have left, center, right, and right. This is ridiculous, because at the end of the day, when we start looking at the Bible and we're saying center, left, right, there are children of God, and then there are children of the devil. So how you start getting this stuff, like you brought up the term cousins, and I don't know if people would say stepbrethren, just all this different stuff. And so I want people to see this because, I probably think that once you said Christian church and people started picking up, oh boy, this is an interview with someone from the Christian church. So this is the 1990 Dallas meeting, and this is what Ed Harrell had to say about independent Christian churches. Give a listen.
The only thing you need to be careful not to change is your commitment to doing exactly what the scriptures say. The practice may change and may ought to change, but that shouldn't change. On the question whether we're going to be further or does the past teach us anything about that, I think that, as I said in my opening remarks, our communities of connection increasingly separate, and that cannot help but go and even further. Now, actually, there'll be people who ideologically will probably still be pretty close together. When I used to teach up in East Tennessee, I knew some of those conservative Christian church preachers, and we were actually very close together. In fact, I was a lot closer to them than I was to the institutional Church of Christ preacher. And so that kind of relationship will remain, but the truth of the matter is our relationship, associational relationship, will become more distant.
Now, that is not an incorrect statement. I, in fact, would have a lot more in common with Victor Knowles than I would John Mark Hicks. And somebody said, well, how could that be? John Mark Hicks just retired from Lipscomb. That doesn't mean anything. and that's really part of the issue and part of the idea for having the interview with Victor, is that it's just a shame that we don't know that. Like he was saying, I could have conversation with these, and he called them conservative, independent Christian church preachers. He said I could be having conversation with them and be a lot closer with them than mainline institutional Church of Christ folk. Yeah, that goes for Victor Knowles. And I'm not saying Ed to Victor Knowles. I'm saying me to Victor Knowles. They're just, and y'all, when you're, let me put this back up. Just having the Church of Christ on the sign, there are so many people that assemble in a building that have Church of Christ on the sign that I have such little in common with. The way that y'all's girls dress, the activities that y'all's young people are involved in. I'm saying, like, just, y'all, mixed swimming is something, whether y'all want to admit it or not, and the young teenage boys love young women in bathing suits. And we all know that lust is in the New Testament. And I just can't understand it. And going to the beach in the summertime, and I say to get an eye full of backside, I just don't understand the stuff that y'all are doing. And then another thing that we always talk about, I don't understand, and this is a big one for Victor Knowles. Victor Knowles has been an evangelistic man his whole preaching career. Now, you're going to find all that stuff out in the interview, but let me just say this. You know, Victor Knowles, it wasn't until the 80s that he preached at a congregation that had Christian church on the sign. Up until then, it had been the Churches of Christ. But he's evangelistic, and I know people who assemble where there's Church of Christ on the sign, and y'all don't evangelize in any way. So that's some of the stuff like that we're trying to communicate with these discussions.
Caleb, like when I was in College Station, Texas A&M, and you know, I was there to try to talk to guys at the Texas School of Preaching. I end up visiting with a guy who's over the cowboy churches in the area. They got a big tent going up, and they're fixing to build an arena, the whole bit. He's a Baptist. And he tells me, and I absolutely know it is the truth, he said the Church of Christ in the A&M congregation is a what did he say? Baptist without a piano.
Yeah.
He said, y'all are just like us. And I agree that is the case. Many of these folk are just exactly like the Baptists in town, depending on which Baptist we're talking about.
Right.
He was not a co-op. You know, this guy is a independent fundamental type, or could be even Southern Baptist, but it's like sometimes I feel like we're wasting our breath with some of these brethren because they are so far gone. They would be way, way past, he's left in this picture, they are way, way past Victor Knowles.
Yeah.
And we have to say this, I have to say this because I've worked in Texas, lived in Tennessee, Caleb's lived in Tennessee, I preached in a congregation in Tennessee, and I did not know Christian church, Church of Christ, like I do up here. And what Ed was talking about in East Tennessee, the Christian church is different.
Yeah.
Different than you guys down in the South, way, way south. Tennessee is south, but still. The further south you go, the more community church oriented they would be. But the folk up here, we had people that came in from across the mountain when I first got here to Martinsville, and depending on which preacher they had at the Christian church, which was called the Church of Christ, they were basically interchangeable in their names. Depending on the preacher, they didn't use the mechanical music. One preacher would be against it. That would have been in the 90s.
Right.
And another would say, well, no, let's use it. Well, sometimes they didn't have a piano player. And it came down to just as simple as that. You could go there and you'd say, hey, there's a piano up in here. Well, they're not using it. Somebody might say, well, they know it's you. They know you're here. No, they don't have a piano player. But still, I'm saying there are variables, and we're not in any way making a blanket statement about the independent Christian church. And I'll just say this, Caleb. Today, after all this time with this interview, I learned from him that he was saying independent from the disciples of Christ. I thought he was talking about autonomy.
Right.
I thought they were talking about autonomy all this time. Independent. It's independent. He said independent from the disciples of Christ. Did you already know that? I did not. So it's a learning,
Right. And he would make a note too in the interview, like when you said about being in Texas, where Victor's from in Seymour, Indiana, and Iowa. He said up there, everybody was just the Church of Christ. They might refer to themselves sometimes as a Christian church, he said, but most of them were using piano. And he said, as you get down into Texas, he said, that's where he said the Christian church is going to like exclusively be, back then it would have been, exclusively Christian church equals piano. And he said, but it just wasn't that way where I came from. And so, and you know, it's like, you have to, do you say this? You have to consider these are the days before the internet.
Yes.
And it's like, man, you're just telling me that you're in an area where this is all you know. And it's like, and if you don't venture outside of where you're from, then nobody's going to suggest to you, like, have you thought that this is a problem? No, because no one that I was raised up around ever thought that it was a problem. And that's even your grandmother-in-law, Granny. What would she say about being in the Christian church?
My grandmother?
No, Mom's.
Oh, okay.
Granny and Scat.
Well, that literally was a Church of Christ that came through the time frame that we're going to talk about in this book.
Right.
So those people, when you said her mother, we're talking great, we're talking 1900.
Yeah.
And even before the 1900s. So she was in a church, and I know the building now. They've tried to add on to the building. It says Church of Christ meets here outside. They tried to add on to the building. They went to the courthouse and they said, you can't add on to this building. Texas laws are just kind of whatever. This is a Christian church and you can't be changing. Well, they didn't even know it was a building that was occupied by the Christian church, but how many of their relatives actually obeyed the gospel prior to the split? And does that mean anything prior to the split? We're going to get into that.
So here's some more, and I'm saying, you know, to think about this in these terms too. Why is it the case that when we start talking about there needs to be unity, that if somebody said, well, we're going to go over here, we're going to go talk to these Baptists, and someone said, that's good, because, you know, someone needs to work on the Baptist folk. And someone says, we're going to go over here, we're going to talk to these folk, we're going to talk to those folk. But as we were saying now, it's like, if you say, well, what we're going to do now is we're going to go over here and we're going to talk to these people from the independent Christian churches. And I think that's where a bunch of people would, you know, raise up a flag and say, well, we're not going to do that. And someone says, well, why not? And they say, well, we're not going to do that unless we get over there and they start making us think like they think. But in reality, are you not going over there to make them think the way that you think? And they're people, and they're religious, and it's like we talk about, well, there needs to be unity, and I'm all for that, but you're going to have to talk to people if there's going to be unity. Now, here's the next thing that I would say. What people don't realize, and I'm trying to look at myself and look at all these moving pieces. You know, a lot of people watch Steve Wolfgang, and the word is in the title, but a lot of people watch Steve Wolfgang and they say, oh yeah, Steve Wolfgang, anti. But what they don't realize is that there is a circle of people out there that called every single one of these people, including me, they would have called every single one of us anti. If you, back in the early 1900s, if you were a member of the Church of Christ and you were in an a cappella only congregation, there were people inside of the independent Christian church who would have called you an Annie. And it's like you've been out here calling Steve Wolfgang an Annie, didn't even know that you were an Annie to somebody else. And so that's the stuff where I go and I sit down with them. And, you know, I have Victor's books with me tonight, and even, like, don't you just get sick of this talking about wings?
Yeah.
So, Victor makes notes in his book where he says, you know, it's not just a cappella churches of Christ. And he makes notes in his books where he says, independent Christian church folk don't want to talk to the Church of Christ anymore. The Church of Christ wants to talk to independent Christian church folk. That's ridiculous. And
well, you know, it did sound like Ed Harold didn't really care to talk to these preachers in the institutional side, and I don't blame him.
Right.
You know, to a degree, you're not making any headway because when they want to do something, they want to do it.
Yeah.
And logic isn't even in it.
Yeah.
So I can see that he was talking to people that would have very much in common with him, and they had this area that they went off into.
Yeah.
And
So
that's the piano.
Right, and the way that you said that is actually what Alan Heyer said about independent Christian church. Yeah, Alan Heyer said about independent Christian church folk is, he said about their argument is they want the piano, they're going to have it. Well, that argumentation goes back to mainline institution. We want to have this school funded out of the treasury. We're going to do it, and so it did work out that way. Now,
can we say this too? This is not a broad brush either for the Christian church. We are talking about a man that is 80 years old.
Yeah.
And we're talking about his legacy. what went on in his lifetime. He bemoans the liberalness that we were talking about down in Texas and whatnot. He's not involved with all of these people.
Yeah.
And neither is, just for instance, did you get in touch with a local Christian church?
Yes.
Preacher? He won't let himself be called a pastor.
Right. Yeah.
And they have elders there. He is an evangelist. His name's Dean Ashby. And he bemoans this just like Victor does.
And really, the thing about like visiting with, when I would visit with Dean Ashby is he's only just a couple years older than you, but it's like he sees all this stuff and he says, I don't like it. And this stuff is going on, and he said, I don't participate in it, and I try to stop it where I can. And it's like, well, here I am over here, and I would say, you are actively fighting against stuff. I don't participate in it. I try to stop it as much as I can try to stop it. And it's like, that's just the same stuff in a different location. I mean, and the same for him. He said, I'm not doing women preachers. Dean Ashby, I'm not doing women preachers. And he said, I see a bunch of people doing it. Dean Ashby said, I'm not doing Calvinism. I don't get it any more than he does. He was telling me, I don't know why these guys get off into Calvinism.
Well, Caleb, let me just, this might help. Don Blackwell, did you know that a local Christian church preacher, not pastor, is handing out your DVD on why are there so many churches? How about that? That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Individuals who recognize this is a good piece of information and it's very well done, and he's handing it out. Did he have other things?
He had another one. I can't remember what it was. But then he also, as we were talking, he showed me a number of books that would be on his bookshelf. He said a number of books on his bookshelf, he'd pull them out and show it to me, would be written by members of the Church of Christ. And I told him, I said, it does not go both ways.
Well, in the day, his daughter went to Lipscomb, and he himself, who can I talk to? Dan Cates. He himself went to Alabama School of Religion. And did we check if John Mark was there during that time frame?
Yeah, he was there.
He was there.
Yeah.
And Alabama School of Religion was not a liberal school in those days. So is that not amazing? This guy's from Virginia.
Right.
And he went to Alabama School of Religion, which is founded by Rex Turner, and his daughter was going to Lipscomb. Mm-hmm. Now, who would have thought that?
And he was nervous about it. Dean Ashby was nervous about that aspect. So, and there'll be some people right now where they'll hear this and they'll just say, I don't care a thing about commonality. Yeah, I don't know that you're going to be doing too much with it anyway. Yeah. It's like if you just hear this information and you're not going to be willing to process and say, oh, well, I didn't know this, but here's the next thing too.
Well, let me say this before we go on with that. Don't think you're going to go down to the local Christian church where they meet and that you're going to find a Dean Ashby.
Right.
Because you're not.
Yeah.
And that's something that I found out totally by second generation. You, talking to Dean Ashby, he was always a foe to me. And I'm saying he still is a foe in the sense that we all know the mechanical music and whatnot. But I never knew that he was not the champion that everybody wanted him to be against us. He was actually agreeing with us 99% of the time is what he says. Yeah. And a lot of them used to call me around here and say the same thing. And
so you have this, and there's a book that people could read, but it's about the hermeneutic discussion, and it's called, Marvin Phillips has a book called Don't Shoot, We Might Be on the Same Team. But he talks about how it is a different hermeneutic. And so if there's command, examples, and inferences, that's not how some people in the independent Christian church were reasoning. They would call things, is it biblical? Is it unbiblical? Is it anti-biblical? Which is a totally different purview. So, but now throw this up there. People, you maybe didn't know that while you were calling Steve Wolfgang an anti, you didn't know there was a whole collection of people calling Alan Hires and, back in the day, Rubel Shelley. They were antis because they had been opposed to instrumental music. Now, here's the other thing that just has to be addressed. You look at someone like Victor Knowles, and I tell Victor Knowles in the interview that he's conservative. Ed Harrell referenced those people inside, he said, conservative, independent Christian church preachers. So I tell Victor he's very conservative. The Atumwa Brethren, very conservative.
Explain that word.
It's just a location in Iowa, and there is a school there, School of Evangelism. If you read this book, Taking a Stand, which is by Victor Knowles and William E. Paul, the story of the Ottumwa Brethren, they were evangelistic, they were debating, and you'll find that in the interview. But here's what I would say. Someone says, well, those people can't be conservative. They use a piano in their worship. All these men, David Lipscomb, J.W. McGarvey, N.B. Hardeman, who among them, and that at the end is Isaac Garrett, who among them did not worship with instrumental music? And so if you just take that note and say, well, they can't do anything right because they got a piano, well, then you're just not going to be able to do this. And here's the thing, too. Someone says, well, eventually they stopped. It took them a long time to stop. And also, when they stopped based on their hermeneutical practice, there would be people to the right of them saying, and there's some other stuff y'all need to stop doing.
Well, here's the thing, too. A lot of them stopped, but they continued to hold protracted meetings, evangelistic events.
Would be
with
J.W.
these
McGarvey.
other individuals, right.
So it's like you got some people saying, well, I'm not going to do it, but I am going to go almost just everywhere under the sun where they are doing it. And the only person I don't have up there pictured is James A. Harding, and he was ready to stop with it.
He was ready to withdraw fellowship with them early, and Lipscomb, he worked with Lipscomb. Can't see which way I'm going here. And he wasn't ready. Lipscomb was not ready to make the split.
Now, when I say this is typical to the interviews and these discussions, my big thing is trying to be consistent, at least trying to be consistent, and then talking to people like you said a moment ago. Sometimes it feels like we're wasting our breath talking with people who don't want to make a change and they don't want to talk to anybody. So this business of the inconsistency, in 1984, I put it up there in the header, Rubble blamed independent Christian churches. So, and I said to Rubble in the interview, I think more people opposed his book than actually read it. So Rubble said, although I have a piano in my house too, we don't use it in our worship times. Each of us has a distinctive view on the matter, and we have contrary practices. Though disagreed, we are not divided. This very situation existed among brethren in the Restoration movement of the 19th century. By the late 19th century, some brethren insisted on narrowing the very broad principle of restoration by forcing the instrument into congregational worship in different locations, while admitting that worship without the instrument was certainly acceptable. They forced their opinion about instruments in worship on those whose understanding of the Scripture would not allow them to accept it in good conscience. And I say the inconsistency is that these men all used it for a good portion of time, and you still refer to them as conservatives. Rubel was on the chopping block in 1984, and he was placing the blame at the feet of people promoting the instrument. You cannot have it both ways. You can't just be looking at stuff and saying, well, and essentially what it comes down to is I don't like this person, and this person is my party figure.
Well, another thing, too, is there are going to be people that are going to say to us, and I'm just going to say, let's just say Gary Summers. Gary might say, listen, we've already talked to those people. Mm-hmm. He's older than I am. I think he's 15 years older than I am. 15 years before you even came along, Johnny, we all talked to those folk, and here we are. Well, okay, I'm fine with y'all talking to those folk, but maybe I'm better at it than y'all are. I guarantee you nobody is getting into all of these events like you are. Mm. And I'm there with you behind the scenes, so we get to talk to them, and I get to go back in some of these places. I've already been back to see Victor. But here's the thing. Everybody has 120-something years from the split in some of these instances, and we're not even talking about the anti-split.
Right.
So these folk, and including ourselves, should be realizing everybody's religion is on the decline. What are you going to do? We already talked to them. Well, is that not a good seedbed? Sometimes I say no. I'm not talking about Victor, but right. I'm talking about sometimes it's Baptist or Methodist. I would rather them not have all their traditions or whatever and just a blank slate. Yeah. Well, but still, there are individuals. A guy called me the other night just as I got off, and I ended up saying, "Yeah, I've done that, Nick. I've made a better Baptist out of a Baptist." And I'm saying that in quotes. Mm-hmm. He actually taught a guy, convinced him that he must be baptized for the remission of his sins, and he went to the Baptist church and was baptized. And the guy said, I'm baptizing you not for the remission of your sins. Well, he didn't care.
Yeah.
But what he ended up doing is now he's a more faithful Baptist than he was before.
Right.
And I just said, I have had to deal with that. I don't know what will happen next. But still, you can't just say, well, we've talked to them before. You can say that if you want to, and y'all can all die if you like. But there are people like Victor that I believe Victor is a genuinely honest individual, and who knows? We are not compromising.
Well, I think too that when you said about we've already talked to those people, I think that there could be people, and this is the way it works too, so let me put another one. So I think that there could be people who said, well, back then I was okay with the instrument, and then they say, but I don't like how it turned into this full-fledged band.
Yeah.
And it turned into a production with, the lights and the fog and the on and the on. Well, those people can exist, but maybe they don't know what to do about it. And I would say, and those people are inside of mainline a cappella. They are sick and tired of the absolute nonsense that they have gotten from being essentially a glorified pep rally. And then here's the other thing. This is Richard Hughes, and in the same way where I say everybody had rubble on the chopping block, even while he was saying instrumental folk press their opinion. Well, then here's Richard Hughes in his book, Reviving the Ancient Faith, and he basically says, in this quote, that non-institutionals were getting it right. Here's a big, long quote. By now we begin to see what Thomas Connolly had in mind when he wrote in 1982 that the Churches of Christ in Nashville constituted a middle-class establishment. Through the process of modernization, development of various para-church institutions, which would be colleges, Parachurch institutions, the Church of Christ developed almost everywhere in the United States into a well-established institution in its own right. Put another way, the Church of Christ was no longer a sect, much less an informal movement. It had become instead a full-blown denomination, at least in terms of its social standing in the context of American culture. This was the issue of which leaders in the anti-institutional movement had pointed all along. In spite of all this, however, most leaders of mainstream churches of Christ never fully comprehended the issues that the anti-institutional people sought to raise. So, where we are, there could be a lot of people who don't necessarily know where they are. Like we said about, Victor said, I was like 12 years old before I even heard that there were people who didn't worship with instruments. Well, there could be people out here who are just saying, there's so much nonsense that happens on a Sunday, and everything else, like they come in and they think they're going to have a biblical lesson, but instead, like I said, it's a pep rally, and we got somebody over here to talk to us about whatever this ministry is and this and that, and they say, I'm sick of it. Well, they don't know what is out there. And it would be what he's saying, and Richard Hughes is not a non-institutional anti. Here's one more. The premillennial movement kept alive the apocalyptic orientation of the Stone Campbell tradition. Look what he says about antis. While the anti-institutional movement kept alive the democratic and legal biases that can be traced especially to those who radicalize Campbell's Christian Baptists, their allegiance to the ideals of the 19th century became heretical only in the context of modernizing tendencies of 20th century churches of Christ. So I read that, and it sounds like he's saying the people who changed are the people who we call in the middle. And they got away from what was trying to happen in the 1800s. We're local, autonomous congregations, and that's it.
So, you could be listening to this, and you've developed this in my mind of late, Caleb, that there's no way that people have the inclination to search a lot of this stuff out, and we find it out, and we just have to give it to them that you're going to have to do some research, and we're trying to help you do it. Dale Jenkins, if you will just, Dale, I'm talking to you, Dale Jenkins, you are changing the body of Christ so radically with all of that foolishness that y'all are doing for these young kids with the lights and the strobe lights and all of that stuff that y'all are doing. It looks exactly like Stephen Furtick. What is that? What is he over there in Charlotte?
Yeah.
Elevation Church?
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
It's unbelievable in a generation that you guys have done that. I mean, I remember when Jubilee, they did a skit type thing where Rubble, who was in the casket?
I always heard it was Rubble.
Okay, it was Rubel.
And like Amy Grant was there.
Amy Grant was singing during the invitation for Jeff Walling.
Okay.
And it's just like and we thought that was like the worst you could possibly get. But Dale Jenkins and company, I don't know who all's involved with it, but I'm saying if you just stay with Dale Jenkins and just keep searching, you're going to see your kids involved in what the Christian church around here is doing, and Mercy Crossing the Pentecostal. Remember when the folk from Kentucky went over and went inside and talked to Jackie Poe?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, man.
And what his response of the Church of Christ is giving us fits?
Yeah, but he went in there and there were strobe lights everywhere.
Yeah,
if you remember that.
No,
So,
I didn't remember. Now, does this part make sense? Because now I'll play a clip. When I did visit with Dean Ashby, and remember, like when Dad said, Dean Ashby preaches, he's the evangelist with the County Line Christian Church, and I asked him, like I said, where we are, and I said, where y'all are, and he gets it. And I said, so what do you think? And he said, I think everybody shifted to the left. And he said, the disciples of Christ have always been on the far out left. They're just getting crazier. That's true. He said, but I think the independent Christian churches, he said, they shifted to the left. And then he said, wouldn't you say that the Church of Christ has shifted? And I said, absolutely they have shifted to the left. Just astronomical amounts. So here's the thing, too, when I say about people getting to, like, process in themselves.
I too appreciate the opportunity of being here this evening.
What is it that a cappella says to instrumental people, instrumental music folk? Can't y'all just, what is it?
give it up.
Can't y'all just give it up for the sake of unity? So again, this is the 1990 Dallas meeting, and this is Melvin Curry. Melvin Curry was one of the teachers at Florida College. He's non-institutional, but listen to what he says back to Gus Nichols' son, Hardeman Nichols. Listen to this.
And sharing with you just a couple of minutes of introductory thoughts. Long ago, I was impressed with two principles that seem to be embedded in the New Testament
This is
that
2
speak
minutes
to
long.
the kind of attitude that I must have and that all of us should share with respect to the Scriptures. The first is that we respect the individual conscience of one another. And the older I become and the more involved I get in various issues, no matter what they are, the more I respect what Paul had to say in passages like 1 Corinthians chapter 8, or Romans 14, or other passages that have a bearing on the question of conscience. We should not, under any circumstance, cause a brother to offend by a liberty that we possess. And I suppose that the whole question of authority comes down to the matter, are we really and sincerely willing to give up our liberty for unity? I have many head-on discussions with individuals with whom I differ, and sooner or later it just comes down to that. The other principle that seems to me to be embedded in the Scripture.
Now that's it. Like when you said Don DeWelt, Don DeWelt would have said that we think instrumental music is a liberty. And then people on the other side of Don DeWelt would have said, well, Don, if it's just a liberty, can't y'all stop using that liberty for the sake of all of our unity? Well, here's Melvin Curry saying it back to the same people who would have then taken that and said it to Don. They say to Don, and I would just say Hardeman Nichols. Hardeman Nichols would say to Don DeWelt, can't you just give it up for the sake of unity? Well, here's Melvin Curry saying, can't y'all stop this, which would basically be how the colleges were funded and other institutions were funded. Can't y'all do it a different way? Which is essentially what it comes down to is, as Richard Hughes says, people mainline didn't understand the non-institutional idea. No one has a problem that a college exists, but how did we get to the point where someone says it's an extension of the home and the church?
Yeah.
Nothing to do with either one.
So, this is not a hermeneutical argument that I'm about to make, but just take it for what it's worth. If a thing leads to something, look where all of our colleges, when I say our, it's accommodative. They're not mine, they're not Christian, but look where they are and look what they've done, and they're on the decline. And they themselves have even touted, we've got 60% denominational people in the Abilene, and then they realized what they just did to themselves. I sent my kids out there to be around Christians. Well, then they tracked that back, but I'm saying it's still there. And then look at what Victor is bemoaning. I hope he doesn't mind me speaking for him. The big band, the whole it's just like a concert. That's what it leads to. And, it used to be said, well, if you had a piano in the basement, it's going to be the next generation, it's going to be in the worship. Some things you can just look at it and say, this is what this leads to. And, another person, well, that's not a hermeneutical argument. It's not sinful.
Right.
Well, what you actually see it leading to, are you for that? No. Is it sinful? You may say no. I don't see how you can say the school turning into just a full-blown denominational place.
Factory.
Yeah. And so, even if you didn't argue that way, you can see this is destroying us. And so what we're saying tonight is, are you out there? Do you want to have this discussion? Do you want to help gather folk of like mind together and try to push back? Because if we don't, we're already losing the country.
Yeah.
So,
like you said a moment ago, religiously speaking, nobody's doing well.
Right.
And so when you brought up the colleges too, Lipscomb had a religious graduate program in Austin. They shut it down. Harding had their graduate campus in Memphis, and they shut it down and brought it back to Searcy. And then Oklahoma Christian had some type of religious graduate program, and then they shut that down. So no one's doing well.
Right.
And then two, I'll go back over here because it was something you said earlier that it was about the debating. Why is it that, we talk about spiritual sword and we all romanticize the past, but then you say, well, do we want to debate today? No. And it's like, we have schools. Are they producing debates? And it's just, everybody has to think about, and this is again, and I'm saying this as a thumbs up. When I was talking to Dean Ashby, he said, not only did he say, I'm not the pastor around here, and then he said, and we have elders. He said, I'm an evangelist and we have elders. And so it's like, how is it that we don't have evangelistic fervor? We don't have debate mentality. And when you look at the history books, everybody says debates is what made it what it was. And we'll get this.
What made our new president? The debate. He won the presidency on the night that he debated Joe Biden. Whether you like it, indifferent, whatever, everybody, including them, say that was the end for Joe Biden.
Yeah.
It was a debate.
And that's what they say about, was it JFK and Richard
Nixon?
Yeah, it's like once you could see it and you saw how much he was sweating, and it's like, well, someone says, well, don't compare that debate to this debate. Well, debating is debating. Debating
is debating, and we've done it to ourselves. We've made it something that you can't do. It's looked down on. It's uncouth, as Alan Hire said, that some people say. I even had a Pentecostal that debated me, and he said the Lord led him to have a debate. And it's like, y'all were all saying, I'm not saying brethren, but the sectarian folk around here, oh, debating's wrong. And then he gets on television and says the Lord led him to debate me.
Yeah.
And it's just like, what in the world are y'all thinking? And, does it come down to, Caleb, that people just don't love lost souls? They don't care about this? And they may be looking at us tonight and thinking, y'all are just so fervent about this. And it's, at the end of this, somebody's got to say, what did y'all think y'all had to gain? What we think that we have to gain is getting someone interested to talk to somebody else and help this along.
Yeah.
I was thrilled to be in Joplin. And not only did we be in Joplin, we ended up getting a chance to stop by the local Tulsa One Cup congregation. And come to find out, there's a guy there. Should I mention his name or not? Does he care?
Oh, I don't know.
I don't know why he would care. Clinton DeFrance. It was a wonderful chance to get to talk to somebody post-COVID, and it just was amazing, the mentality that I found in this man. And so if all of us, if you could actually be involved with a few people and find out, there are people that realize that religion, the Lord's church, is on the decline big time, and if we don't do something, just like what I said about 2 Chronicles 30 a minute ago with Hezekiah, if we don't do something, then we're all going to just splinter. And I hate it.
Well, at this point too, I mean, there are some, this is my view of it, some people are still having some doctrinal conversations that cause them to splinter, but I think a lot of other people, I think, are just getting bored and they're leaving, and it's like, we don't do anything here except eat, and so we could do whatever you're not doing at home.
Well, we diagnosed the patient during COVID. They didn't come back.
Yeah.
And that told you where they really were. They didn't want to be there. Mom and daddy may be still alive, or whatever it is was keeping them. I want to go, but whatever people say, I can't make myself because I feel bad if I do. But COVID came along, and man, these folk are gone and they're never coming back. That's what the patient was really, that was his status all the time.
Yeah. Well, some of this too, like when he said a moment ago, if you go, you watch this and you say, well, I am going to go talk to so-and-so in the Christian church down the road. And then his response was, it probably won't be like Dean Ashby. It probably won't be like Victor Knowles. So does everybody remember when I was in preaching school and I wrote that paper for Wesley Simons? I talked to 23 preachers in the independent Christian church. And this is something that you and I have talked about since then. I only found one preacher in Elizabethton, and I talked to some of them who were back here too. But there was only one preacher that when I asked the question, does a person have to be immersed to be saved? Only one of them just went, yes. Mm. Everybody else, 22 out of the 23, had to dance around and do this and that. And that same man too, I asked him, I said, when was the beginning of the Church of Christ? Acts 2 or 1801? Only one. And his name is Michael Kororshak. If he's, I don't know if he would ever see this, but Michael Kororshak was the only one who said, yes, you have to be baptized. And then he's the only one who just flat out said, Acts 2 is the beginning of the Church of Christ. Everybody else said, we started at the Cane Ridge Revival. But anyways, here's my thing. What that essentially proved was that I found 22 preachers that were just weak.
In a particular area.
In a particular area, I found 22 preachers that just were weak on their doctrine. And, somebody who's on the outside, they could say, I'm going to write a paper where I go and talk to all these preachers from the Church of Christ. Mm. And there's just no telling. They could make their questionnaire, and boy, they could find some weak preachers. So let me wrap this up and we'll move into yours, because I do want people to think about this. At some point in the day, when we start talking about religious unity, it is going to include numbers. Okay? So that we don't, what Mormons say, well, we got more members in America than anybody else, we must be doing something right. And Roman Catholics say, well, we've got more blah, 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 so we must be doing something right. Well, we all know that's not how to think, and it doesn't prove anything, but I would say this. If you are becoming more unified, you are, in fact, going to have more numbers. So this is a book that we've shown before. This is Samuel S. Hill. And don't lose your head. I don't like the rebel flag. Okay, and so Southern Church is in crisis, and that's what he's talking about. And he has a chapter in his book where he said in the South, the two biggest religious entities were Baptists and Methodists. But then he has this note. He says, however, this reckoning leaves out of account a communion which almost certainly ranks third among the Southern Protestant families. And then he says this, it is the Church of Christ. The churches of Christ with a membership estimated to be in excess of 1,500,000 in Tennessee, Alabama, Kentucky, Arkansas, and Texas. But here's the thing, when you go down here, look what he says. The churches of Christ have what the statisticians call confirmed membership, which means that they exempt from their membership rolls the very young who are the children of adult members and those who attend Sunday school but are not yet officially regarded as members of the congregation. So what he says in this note is, if we counted them up, the way that other people want to be counted up, they would have an even greater number than 1.5 million. Now,
I mean, just imagine that. You didn't count any of the small children, and what's the saying? Whatever we count, whatever crawls, balls,
squalls.
Squalls.
Yeah.
And so our brethren were not counting that way, and there's no doubt about it. There would have been an equality, a huge amount.
Yeah. He has another note in this book where he says there also would have been probably more members of the Church of Christ noted. He said if everyone had participated.
Yeah.
So some people got stuff in the mail that said, would you like to help us, get a count? No. And they just throw it away. So here's a moment, too, where someone says, this don't matter. Sure it does. Because we're all talking about how we have a decline in what? Number. The membership is declining. Well, that's number. Well, here they're talking about 1.5 million, and Sam Hill would actually admit this is not even the full number because he says they don't count up their numbers the same way, and not everybody participated. Now, here's Ed Harrell in his book, White Sects and Black Men in the Recent South. Look what he says. The largest of the southern sects is the Churches of Christ, which in 1969 had an estimated membership of 2,350,000. The Churches of Christ are conservative offspring of the 19th century Restoration movement, initiated by Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone. The religious census of 1906 recognized the division of the movement by listing separately the disciples of Christ, the more liberal element which made up a majority of the group, and the Churches of Christ. Now, in the time frame that he wrote this book, White Sects and Black Men, the number had risen from 1.5 million to 2.3 million. That has to matter, the largest. It has to matter when we all right now in 2025 are saying the numbers are down. And this is what he also said. This is another book called Varieties of Southern Evangelicalism. And it says edited by Ed Harrell, forward by Martin E. Marty. The Churches of Christ, and then it says this, and the larger Pentecostal churches were the fastest growing religious groups in the nation for several decades. And it's not like Ed Harrell just made that up. He's quoting from Wilbur Zielinski's An Approach to the Religious Geography of the United States, Patterns of Church Membership in 1952. Now, here's my thing. When you see something like that, I ask the question, how did they do it? How is it the case they were going from 1.5 million to 2.3 million? They were counted as the largest religious group. They were counted as one of the fastest growing religious groups. And someone says, well, how is it that they did it? We all know that it was through debating. When is the time frame that, like, when we think about preaching schools and they talk about debates, when are they thinking?
I would say they're
only
saying from the 50s or 60s backwards.
Yeah. And it's like when we note post-World War II and all the growth, when were we having debates? And what I was going to say is in print, Alexander Campbell has like 5 or 6 debates in print.
Yeah.
And so you just start looking at it, and it is controversy, and it is conversation with other people. Now,
well, Arkansas Angels is basically the turn of the century, let's just say, we'll just go ahead and say 1920 forward.
Mm-hmm.
Those people were in their prime, and, Caleb, we still have 1,000 of those books. It's like,
Arkansas Angels.
Yeah. What would it take for us to get those out just to, because the stories that you hear in there are they're phenomenal. They are inspirational, and there is just no way a person can read that book and come away saying, debates just don't do any good. I think I'll send one to LaGard Smith.
Mm.
He is, one of the individuals that said that he didn't really like debating, and so is that for me, or you're going to say something about that?
Well, I'll have some notes, but then we'll both.
Go ahead.
Well, then another thing too, when you said about the biographies and the motivation, Archie Word, and we were trying to get this book back in print, but this is by Victor Knowles, wrote this book, Archie Word, Voice of Thunder, Heart of Tears, and so you're going to find controversy, evangelism. There will be debates going on. very pointed conversation. I do have to go backwards to where, when you said the quote about Lagarde, and he said, I don't really like the debating, and I don't think that debating works. Lagarde Smith is a product of debating. We all are.
Yeah.
I just don't understand when I read history books and we start denigrating the debates. A great big portion of folk who inhabit the Church of Christ would not be where they are if it weren't for the debates. That stuff, and it's like someone says, well, my aunt didn't like the debate. If I had to live off of what my aunts do and do not like, there's no telling where I'd be. So, I just don't get that. I don't get where we say, I don't like debating, but if you read any history text, we always say we're the product of logic, proof text, and debating. It is just what made folk, where someone says they cut their teeth on it. Now, I want to say this too, like Dad said a moment ago, this is not like some blanket endorsement for the Christian church, and it's certainly not for instrumental music. When Victor talks with me about restoration forums that started in the 80s, he said every year when we came back, he said instrumental music was always on the table. He said we were always discussing it. Rubble debated Don DeWelt on the instrument, and the way Victor said it was, they got down to business. So that was always there. And then one more was, in the 60s, Leroy Garrett went to a unity meeting, and somebody said, we don't need to debate the instrument anymore. It's in the 60s. And Leroy said, yes, we do. We need to keep debating it. So there's nothing wrong with having that conversation, keeping it going. But at some point, though, we have to say, I would say this, I could ask people right now, do you use instrumental music? And they would say no. And then I would ask them, why? And they wouldn't have anything to say. And that's as problematic as anybody on the opposite side who can't justify why they're doing what they're doing. So I want to say this. I have at the top, uninformed judges. Hey, if you're somebody out here who is opposed, and I'm opposed to instrumental music, but if you're someone who's opposed to instrumental music, and you don't like that I went to interview Victor Knowles, let me ask you this question. Have you read this book yet, The Christian Scholar? Because Dad has been recommending that book for years. Have you read The Eyes of Jehovah, which is the biography of James A. Harding? Have you read that yet? Have you read, there's 3 options to read about Daniel Summer. William Wallace did his. Whoever wrote that, I think his name is Morrison, wrote the yellow book for Daniel Summer, and then Steve Wolfgang's master's thesis is easily accessible online to read about Daniel Summer. If you have not read these 3 books, I don't know how you just get to mark me off for talking to Victor. This man is the protege of J.W. McGarvey, and he was telling everybody, I have this unanswerable argument for instrumental music. James A. Harding was ready to separate over the piano. David Lipscomb dragging his feet, and it's like, don't give me this business about you're not going to reach them, you're going to change anybody's mind, anything like that. So here's...
When you say him, Christian Scholar also, he was together with M.B. Hardeman. Was he vice or co-president?
They were
both together
yeah.
at Freed Hardeman, maybe even before it was Freed Hardeman, but still I'm saying that's his legacy to be that high up in the 1920s.
Right. And so with this is back to where I said a moment ago, stuff that people have not thought about, they haven't asked the question, and then here's the thing too, we will get to a point where someone will say back to me, Caleb, I did ask those questions, and I have thought about it, and I didn't change. Okay, that's very possible, but here's what I want people to look at. You got it?
Yep.
Where's this great big book? Bring us back, Joey, so that people can see how... Oh, we're still... Okay, this great big, thick book is from 1904. This book was shown to us, and then show them like the paper side. Okay, huge book. This was shown to us this past summer. Jason Love visited the tent meeting. He is from Missouri, or he's living in Missouri, living and working in Missouri. And he came into the tent and he showed us this book. And he asked me, he said, have you ever seen this? The guy who wrote, his name is John Brown. And I said, no. So we thumbed through it together. And in 1904, John Brown put so much work, and it's not, he found the as best as he could, the numbers and the stats for congregations of the Church of Christ in America, Australia, possibly England, and Canada. So John Brown does all this work, and it's a great big book, and he does it, and it gets put out there, and it's got pictures in it, a lot of detail, 1904.
Forward by J.W. McGarvey.
Okay, so like someone says, well, who is this John Brown?
Yeah.
Well, it was acknowledged by J.W. McGarvey. He wrote the foreword for it. Now, let's just have the screen only. This is what you find in 1904, the latest stats of the church by states. And in those columns, what you get is the number of the churches. So in 1904, there were, I believe that number is 10,900 congregations in the United States. And the membership in 1904 was 1,220,000. And as I was sitting with, now we'll come back. As I was sitting with Jason Love, I didn't think of it. I'm just looking at this book, and he's showing me interesting stuff. And then he says this. He says, all that work made worthless in 2 years.
Obsolete. The book was obsolete.
Yeah, obsolete in 2 years. And what he meant by that was the 1906 split happened. And this is what you get. In North, this is where we live. Dad and I, this is where we live and work. In North Carolina, you had, in 1904, you had 15,800 members. In Virginia, you had 22,400 members. In 1904, these were the members of the Church of Christ in North Carolina, 15,000, 22,000. I have up at the top 38,000. If that's not right, some math major can correct me. But now look at this note. In the division, the 1906 census, for a discussion of the course of the church in Virginia and North Carolina, according to the 1906 census, the Churches of Christ had a membership of only 415 in the two states. So what happened? We went from 1904, 38,000 in North Carolina and Virginia. 2 years later, it got noted down to 415 shared by the two states. And so what people have not considered is this question of, did 37,000 people become unchristian overnight? Why? Because the government Census Bureau contacted David Lipscomb, who then contacted David Shepard, and J.W. Shepard contacted the Census Bureau? And like I said this a moment ago, N.B. Hardeman, J.W. McGarvey, and whoever else I had on the screen that worship with a piano. And you just say, well, that's just it. That's the end of it. Now, before I have another one, do you have anything to add to that one?
I'm just
so
hearing this.
Okay, so this is a question that no one has talked about. And like, this was his grandmother-in-law, who they called Granny, and the husband is Scat, Granny and Scat. Did she argue with you?
Yes.
So she was saying, like, she would have been telling him, your perception of the Christian church is not what we had back then. Well, when you look at it that way, I have to ask, what was the perception that if 1904 we were calling these people brethren, and we know that people like J.W. McGarvey were worshiping with the piano, and who was that other person that was up there?
Isaac Garrett.
Oh, David Lipscomb. Yeah, David Lipscomb and J.W. McGarvey, and N.B. Hardeman comes later. You know they were doing that. They were worshiping with the piano. 1906 happens, and we say, well, they stopped being Christians in 1906. Do we have something that we disagree over? Sure. But they were arguing about it before 1906. Now, you bring that over to today, and someone might say, well, it's not going to do anything because we've got bigger problems now than just the piano. And that's where I would then say, I don't think that you know who you're talking about. And this is the reason. What you said a moment ago, you asked me that question of would people even recognize if I said Christian church, would they even conceptualize that as something outside or beyond the Church of Christ? And then this idea of the disciples of Christ. I think that people who do have some vision of it, I think they assume that everybody's disciples of Christ. And here's why I would say that it is difficult to have this conversation. This is sources of division in the right there in the title, Sources of Division, the Disciples of Christ, 1865 to 1900. And someone looks at that, they say, 1865 to 1900, the Disciples of Christ denomination didn't even exist yet. Because they're not going to formally, make themselves until 1968. Here's why it's so difficult. Ed Harrell said, it is impossible to write neat narratives about the history of the disciples of Christ because throughout the most of the movement's history, it was a loose and amorphous collection of churches with little central organization and no creed to define orthodoxy. But here's the thing. People will read that quote and they will think that he's talking about the 1968 denomination. They called it restructuring, and we're all going to have that conversation when you watch Victor Knowles tomorrow night, because he and I will talk about 1968. Someone says, well, the Disciples of Christ didn't restructure till 1968. Yeah, that's because in this context, when Ed Harrell says the Disciples of Christ, he's saying that's encompassing term of everybody in America who was dedicated to this idea of restoring the ancient order of things. Right? Do y'all like that? We seek the old paths. Yes. We restore the ancient order. Yes. Well, those people were called disciples of Christ. And someone reads that years later and they say, no, disciples of Christ are these people who don't believe in inspiration. They ordain homosexuals. Not then they didn't. But here's why it also is complicated. This quote again. The religious census in 1906 recognized a division in that movement by listing separately the disciples of Christ, the more liberal element which made up a majority of the group, and then the churches of Christ. Yeah, well, in 1906, when that happened, you still did not have a 1968 Disciples of Christ denomination. You just had people who had the instrument over here, and then people who did not. But before that, they had all, in a large sense, been referring to themselves as disciples of Christ, the Christian churches, the Church of Christ. You could loosely find it here and there. So someone could read that quote, which is another book we're trying to get back in print, and someone reads that quote and they say, well, what about the independent Christian churches? Well, that's a very good question, because the independent Christian churches are not the Disciples of Christ denomination. Someone might say, why is everything just coming out of Ed Harrell? Here's another little book, The Primitive Church in the Modern World, Richard T. Hughes edited. Look at this. So can I have another moment too? Somebody says, Caleb, I'm lost on this. You're going so fast. I don't know. That's how learning works. Well, I am not good at math, okay? And my wife is good at math. And so when she's having to help me with math, she'll talk to me as if I know it. And I'll tell her, I do not know what you were talking about. So we have to go over it over and over and over. And as I get frustrated, that's how people will feel in religious conversations. But you're going to have to do this. Those divisions effectively separated the movement into three informal but distinct groupings of churches. The Christian Church, parentheses, Disciples of Christ, the Christian Churches / Churches of Christ, independent, and the Churches of Christ non-instrumental. Stats information collected in the 4 federal surveys of religious bodies between 1906 and 1936 make it clear that the Disciples of Christ was the most urban and middle class. The independent Christian churches were more rural and lower middle class, and the Churches of Christ included in the poorest and most rural congregations in the movement. So it was a three-way division that did not happen all at the same time. And if you're thinking in those terms and you're saying, well, these people have women elders, these people have women preachers, these people don't believe in the inspiration, these people don't believe in water baptism, you are talking about the wrong people. Now, certainly, Disciples of Christ are still around. In Martinsville, we have 2, and they're divided from each other. And one of them, I haven't been able to talk too much with the one, but the one on Broad Street, they are liberal. I don't even know what they're trying to do over there. And those people have nothing to do with Dean Ashby County Line Christian Church. Now, is it possible that it's that way where you are? Maybe, maybe not. But it's also possible that the Church of Christ where you are is not doing anything with a God-given mission and mandate.
It's possible the Church of Christ is going towards the Disciples of Christ faster than the Christian church around here.
Yeah.
So
Very possible.
let me see the Christian Scholar slide again. Let me make this observation. So this is a brand new book for us, right?
Yes.
Caleb got it to us overnight. It was $100 for the book, and then the shipping was really expensive. And the reason I wanted it is because 1904 is when this was published. 1906, the census was done. This is a reminder for me, an expensive reminder of how fast something can happen right before your eyes. All of a sudden, the government listed the Christian church separate from the Church of Christ. People had family members on both sides everywhere. And Calhoun appeared on, I don't know who's what, I usually don't sit in this chair. Calhoun, this guy was leading the charge for the instrument during this time frame. But by 1920, he had switched. He had been convinced that it was incorrect. He becomes an evangelist in Nashville, Tennessee, in one of the largest congregations in Nashville, one of the most sought-after individuals on the radio. The congregation where he was housed A.M. Burton, a very, very wealthy insurance agent, and A.M. Burton was financing Marshall Keeble, who was a black evangelist who went all over the United States, taught hundreds of thousands of people. I don't know how many obeyed the gospel, but regardless of how many obeyed the gospel, he was teaching people the principles of love your neighbor, be a good parent, be a good mother, be a good father. Just unbelievable influence. And where did that come from? It came after 1906. So there were plenty of individuals that were like recognizing what was going on and making the change. You've got Daniel Summers, who was a member of what would have been the Church of Christ. But all these other individuals were still connected to him. He's probably one of the most ferocious individuals against the mechanical music and willing to debate it. So
willing to go talk to these people. Yeah, and debating and just even, I would say, showing up, which is like, I think we said that before, the conversation, not everything has to be a debate.
Yeah.
I'm all for it.
Yeah.
But it's like I can also show up and just have this conversation with somebody if we can get someone in the room.
Did he talk to A.T. Robertson?
Yeah, he was supposed to. I don't know if he actually did it or not, but Frederick Kirshner was trying to get a sit-down between A.T. Robertson and Daniel Summers.
So, it's just the idea. This book is a very painful, expensive reminder. 2 years. You might say, well, I've been listening to these Candid Christian Interviews for how many? When was Rubble?
Let's just say 2 years.
2 years. And they're not doing any good. 2 years is all it took for this split to crystallize in the United States. And it is unbelievable what can actually happen. And then when you look back, see what was going on. What we're doing in this interview with Victor is we're uncovering what did happen.
Yeah.
And it will start with Archie Word.
Right. And I think the idea, the idea is to say that it could happen again. So when you hear these people that don't believe in inspiration of the Bible, like Victor's dad would have been somebody pressing against those folk. The Bible is inspired of God. And also when you start talking about, these people would say, well, the Church of Christ is just a denomination and we're going to have open membership. Victor's dad is someone who would have been opposed to open membership. Well, if they were there, then I say it can happen all over again, and there's way more activity, like I'm saying, that Victor grew up around, that his dad was an involved figure in. They were very zealous people. Now, I'll just have a couple more of these. Well, no, that's about it. Oh, can I say about the numbers again? When we say, we know that, like someone says, well, numbers don't prove anything. Well, we recognize numbers matter because when you start saying that the membership is on a decline. So do you know, and I said this to Dad that I hadn't recognized this, that we've talked about it before, at the back of the 1890 Hiscox Standard Manual, do you know that the Baptist folk were wanting to claim us, as they would, look, where is it? They say Campbellites. I'm not a Campbellite, but that's what they said. So
I brought one
Yeah.
down here for you.
this is mine.
Okay.
This is mine. This is what a reprint looks like. And you'll find these numbers in the back of the Baptist manual. You know what they're going to call us? The Baptists are going to call me, Dad, you, they're going to call us other types of Baptists. And they're going to have all this list. Can you take us off the screen, please? On this side, this is where they have what? Seventh-day Baptists, Free Will Baptists, Sixth Principle Baptists, Anti-Mission Baptists, and then the next page on 174, they're going to say this: the disciples of Christ, sometimes called Campbellites or Christians, number about 1.2 million. Now bring us back, please. They wanted us in that number to throw it in the face of Presbyterians, Methodists, and Anglicans. Pedo-Baptists. They called us Baptists because they said they're folk who believe in immersion. They're Baptists. I only say that to say this about the term disciples of Christ. Just because someone writing history refers to Christians as disciples of Christ does not mean they are indicating the 1968 denomination. And just because someone picks up the standard manual for Baptists and say, what? The Church of Christ is listed as other Baptists? That doesn't mean anything. And so what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to determine as you're reading it, is there a piece that I'm missing? What is it? And then I'll say this about the how did they do it, and I said it's the debating. Here's some quotes out of the Archie Word biography, and now we'll be ready to switch over
You
to
keep going.
well, this will be it for me.
Okay.
But this note, Archie Word, you can find, it says here, a simple connection linking like-minded men in Portland, San Jose, and Cincinnati was started in November of 1945. And it was a connection that would last until Archie's death in November of 1988. The die was cast. The man from Montevilla had formed a friendship with the three men that would, in short time, forge a new fellowship among the independent Christian churches / Churches of Christ. Archie Word would continue to associate with brethren and churches in the independent movement for the next 5 years, but in 1950, he would cast his lot for good with those who came to be known as the Ottumwa Brethren. And as you read the biography of Archie Word, is Archie just kind of looked around one day and he said, there's a bunch of lukewarm preaching going on right now. And he called it out, and he said this, his term was, he said, this is Jap balloon preaching. You read the book and you watch the interview, you can figure out what that means. He says, this is Jap balloon preaching. He said, we're not hitting on sin and we're not delivering the gospel. And he said, I'm out of here. And when he wrote that, it was against his friend, who I believe would be Bill Jessup, who was at San Jose, which is now just called Jessup University. And everybody said, Archie, what are you talking about? Why would you say this? And Archie's response was, he said, either I have somehow lost the ability to communicate in writing, he said, or y'all read poorly. And he said, it's lukewarm. And he started migrating in a different direction. And then there's another quote that you'll find in the interview. Archie said, preach the word and let her split. And then you go down here. In the same issue, in an article, What Do We Need Most?, he contended that what the church needed most, instead of addition, was a great exodus or a wholesale landslide of subtractions. They don't want to be a part of the mission? Get them out of here. They don't want to preach the gospel? Get them out of here. They don't want to promote unity in the one body? Get them out of here. They don't want to preach on sin? Get them out of here. Look what he said here. I accept the accusation of being an isolationist. And in the light of the scripture by which I try to measure every deed of my life, I am delighted. Boy, he was something else. And you know what? That's the exact same idea as when Hardeman Nichols said to Ed Harrell, he said, Hardeman Nichols said, Ed, there's a bunch of people with us now who used to be with y'all. And he said, should I name names? And then Ed Harrell said, go ahead. I was happy to see him go. What's wrong with that? Because I have it up here. It is a universal problem, and it's only got about two options. Either people are changing or we're going to divide. And the only thing that happens in history, like I'm saying as we move through it, is people act in the moment in accordance with their conscience and the information that they have, and they do it to the best of their ability. And then when you get 50 years later, people look back in retrospect and judge them. And so that's what happens with these history books. And I think people look back at Archie Word and they'd love to pick somebody like Archie Word apart. Archie was coarse, and Archie did this, and Archie did that, and they say things like he drove people away. But there will be loads of quotes where people just say, as far as evangelism and just outright energy, there was no one above him. And I would say this too. If you like the book J.D. Tant, Texas Preacher, then you will love Archie Word. And then when you say, yeah, but Caleb, I read Archie Word and he's got that piano. Yeah, get ready to read J.D. Tant and say, what was he doing? What was he thinking? Yeah, J.D. Tant did some stuff that he shouldn't have been doing.
He was involved in the Missionary Society himself. So I just got this book today, right?
That's right.
Did you give it to me today?
This morning.
So Des Moines, Iowa, we're talking about what was going on back in this time frame in 1902. The split happens in this is written in 1904. He has numbers up to 1902. The split is crystallized, codified into our census by the government in 1906. But listen to this. In Des Moines, Iowa, in 1891, there were 3 congregations. By 1902, there were 8. Now get this. In 1891, when they had 3 congregations, they had 1,500 members. 9 years later, they had 5,200 members. Do you hear the evangelism that is going on during that time frame? These folk are evangelizing all over the place. Des Moines, Iowa, I wouldn't even thought the church existed in Des Moines, Iowa. I'm saying that's just my historical information. I have to remind myself that it's 1848. That's when the gold rush hit and everybody's heading over to San Francisco. Is that not correct?
I would say so.
So 5,200 individuals back up to Cincinnati or Chicago. 6 congregations in 1891. In 1902, you have 18. Well, what was the number in 1891 of members? 1,060. By 9 years later, it was 4,945. These people are quadrupling during this time frame. Are some of them, do some of them have mechanical music? Yes, they do. Are they teaching the exact same doctrine? Pretty much the exact same doctrine. There was no difference in Calhoun while he was making that unanswerable argument in the 1800s than Calhoun when he changed in 1920, in the mid-1920s. He was teaching the exact same doctrine. He was right beside N.B. Hardeman in the college, in Freed Hardeman College. Then he moved over to Nashville and becomes the most sought after and the most well-known individual in Nashville as far as preaching is concerned. So these folk, it's like the split having to do with the anti-college and the Orpheum and things of that nature. They're the same brethren. After the split, it's the exact same teaching in regard to who's going to be saved, with the exception of what we're going to do after we're saved. Yeah. Is that not correct?
Right. What is the work of the church? How do we do it? How do we worship? Those things. But when you said it that way, so here's something too that I think we would like to get in people's thinking.
Friend who lives in my area and with whom I've had a number of interesting and lively conversations about Restoration history. What I basically try to do in this booklet is to go back about 50 years and talk a little bit about some changes that occurred around the time of World War II, not just in the thinking of one group of brethren, but in society as a whole, and how that affected churches. What developed in the post-war years, and what were the issues and some of the arguments that are used to support that. What caused some brethren to hang a yellow tag of quarantine on other brethren? What caused some brethren to hang a yellow tag of quarantine on other brethren? If we're looking for
So, Steve Wolfgang, of course, from his perspective of 1990, he says, they did it, right? They did the quarantine. Now, let's see if I can find it.
But as time went by, the separation has become more vivid. Mm-hmm. And so today, the average member of the church has no idea who the non-institutional brethren are, and they have no connection with them whatsoever. Right. But it was a big issue at one time.
It caused a lot of division.
The way that you said that of, there would be this disagreement, but they'd keep holding these meetings together. Do you think that?
They did for a while.
Was that confusing to everybody?
Well, the problem became that the men that we call non-institutional, they couldn't leave the issue alone.
So Steve Wolfgang, in 1990 Dallas meeting, he says, why did they quarantine us? Alan Heyer says, because he's saying it from the opposite side, he says, antis wouldn't leave it alone, and I think it might be this one. And he could have gone and taught.
Sure.
But that's where he left it. And then H. Leo Bowles actually went to the meeting, and his statement was, when you guys are ready to give up the piano, we'll be right back where you guys left us. And so
We left them.
right.
They left us.
Right.
Hanging.
1906. So all these discussions with both sides of the aisle saying you did it, and they're saying no, you did it. Another topic, you did it. No, you did it. So what I don't like is the idea, and I have to say this too, I don't like the idea that I can't go talk to Steve and that I can't go talk to Victor and actually talk about what the issues are. And somebody else says, well, we try to go talk to people, but the issues never get brought up because we are a divided people, but nobody wants to touch those things anymore. And not only are we a divided people, we're getting more divided because we have open membership conversation right now, women elders, women preachers, instrumental music is still a conversation, but nobody wants to do it. And so...
And then when you do it, you're actually being labeled. And can I say, pretty much everybody that you've interviewed, with the exception of and it could be this too, Mac Deaver and Bill Lockwood, and I'm just going to say what I say and then we'll go back to that. Pretty much everybody will say we're to the right of all of these folk. We
Yeah.
are to the right of all of these folk. And I'm not, when I say Bill Lockwood, it's not, this is not a pick or whatever. He would say the stuff that we're doing it's almost outlawed, in the brotherhood, the getting on television and calling everybody's name out, airing our dirty laundry, as they say, going into these places with cameras and stuff like that. But we're getting the results that the other people are not getting. I don't know what Mac would say about us one way or the other. I think he probably, after the interview, he would give us credit. But we're certainly to the right, and we're not compromising. We are getting in to have these discussions with individuals. And, when I came here, Caleb, I would just say in the last 15 years, the Christian churches in this area have started having women deacons. 15 years makes a lot of difference. And in the next 15 years, if we don't have these discussions with the people that are left, like Victor and whomever we would want to just say, for instance, one of the things, I don't know if you were going to play this, and I don't know exactly where it is, and I've got like 6 minutes or something. There's no way that I want to play that. But it is Victor saying they left us.
Yeah, I just had
and
that.
then he said y'all had some of the best preachers. What actually happened, in his opinion, and I'm saying I believe it's absolutely the truth, because Daniel Summers is a part of this. He was, what did he say? Hallelujah, they're gone?
Yeah.
So Daniel Summers was one of the most prolific debaters there was, and a lot of our brethren that I associate with in the past, or I used to, they call him an anti of some sort or other. They didn't like him because he was so strict, coarse, whatever.
Yeah.
But he was the reason. A lot of people say he's the reason why we actually know how to debate. But here's my point, and I hope this doesn't anger anybody. But I would say that after the split, having to do with the non-institutional brethren, the Church of Christ continued to grow in a exponential growth. And it's because these guys that left were great preachers too. And they were evangelistic. And on the other side, I hate to aggravate anybody, but we look at the non-institutional folk and they're not evangelistic now. I don't know that they were necessarily evangelistic back then. It's like Alan Hire said, they wanted to get on that issue and stay on that issue. And so every person who's a non-institutional that I have known, that's what they want to discuss with me about. As opposed to, we don't have a kitchen. We've never had a kitchen. And all of the things they're opposed to, we don't even do, with one exception, and I'm not going to name it, but Steve Wolfgang's given me a pass on that. Was that in the interview or after the interview? Where do you take me?
It would be after, where he said, I looked at, he watched our sit down, and he said, I don't think we're saying different things.
About?
Your funding for mission work.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Which, here's another quote, and I skipped over it. So when I had that quote from Richard Hughes, and like I said it this way, I said, blame. In his book, Rubble blamed independent Christian churches for forcing their opinion. And then in his book, I said Richard Hughes blames institutional mainline and says they never understood. But then with what you just said, there's actually a quote too where Ed Harrell says, well, it's happening to antis too. And he says, even more ironic, the anti-institutional churches of Christ themselves could not escape, in the final analysis, the corrosive effects of change and modernization. By 1979, Ed Harrell, a respected leader in the anti-institutional movement, wrote that it was hard to get used to preachers who are well-educated, well-fed, and well-paid. Even though he knew that they ought to be all of those things, he confessed that the anti-institutional churches were filled with bright young people who say all the right things but leave me wondering. So nobody was escaping it. And I don't think that right now anybody is either. So when you said about when we come in contact with non-institutional people, they always want to talk about the same thing. So here is a story. And it goes both ways.
Yes.
So I had a guy contact me from somewhere up North Virginia, and I get on the phone. He says, this Church of Christ? And I said, well, this is Caleb. And I said, I'm a member, right? I have to do that with him. He goes, the church, this is Caleb. He goes, y'all got a piano? And I said, no. No, he said, are you liberal? He said, y'all liberal? I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, y'all got a piano? And I said, no, we don't have a piano. He goes, okay, my uncle is a preacher. I'm going to be there Sunday. I don't care about your uncle. Anyway, he comes in, and he says, do you have a piano? No. And that guy stays at 10 o'clock, and by 11 o'clock, he's getting up and leaving. And Mark McMinnis says, hey, where are you going? He says, I got to go to work. And Mark says, well, we're fixing to have worship. And he goes, well, I got to go to work. And then Mark goes, well, we're going to have communion. And he goes, I know that. I got to go to work. And Mark goes, this is important. And then that guy goes, this is important. I got to go to work. And I didn't know that's why he was leaving. Mark told me. And I said, well, we don't have a piano. He didn't even stick around to we didn't sing at 10 o'clock.
Yeah.
So he was gone before we could have even used it if we had. Then the other side is, we had a woman call me one day again, and she goes, hello, and she says, are y'all conservative? And I said, what do you mean by that? And she said, do y'all eat in the building? And I said, do we eat in the building? I said, or did we build a kitchen out of the treasury? And she had no clue what I was talking about. And I said, we have people that keep office in here. I said, someone's going to eat a sandwich. And she goes, okay, but y'all don't have a kitchen. I said, no, we don't have a kitchen. Okay. It's established. We don't have a kitchen. That woman shows up Sunday morning in a denim miniskirt, showing everything she's got, but we don't have a kitchen. And that's the thing. It's like, no, we don't have a kitchen, but you don't get to talk about it when you show up in your miniskirt to Sunday morning worship. And it's like, how come she knew, well, we're not going to have a kitchen, but she didn't have the concept, I'm going to put my clothes on before I go to worship. It's all across the board. We're going to have to do it. Nobody's escaping it. But that's why we come in and have these conversations, is because we're not going to get any better not talking about it. And everybody's talking about it behind the scenes. So these are my slides. You had some clips. Do you still want to get into it?
No, this was
Okay.
This was excellent. I
Well-
think, Caleb, I might want to play a little bit of Victor just to get to hear more of Victor.
Yeah.
And it would be that point where somewhere in there he's going to say, they left us, and then
Yeah.
it says that about the women preachers.
Do you have any clips about the David Lipscomb part?
No.
So
this would be. I don't think so.
Okay, so let me just say, I basically see this coming.
Okay.
I don't think that there will be some people that will hear Victor and I talk about David Lipscomb and the 1906 census. And the way that we conversationally talk about it, I think there will be some people who will say, that's not the way that it happened. So let me say this. When the Census Bureau contacts David Lipscomb and they ask for numbers and stats, that was the moment that David Lipscomb could have said to those people, do you care about answering the government census? I don't. So David Lipscomb could have said, that's not how God's church works. And he could have told him on the phone, it's not like I'm an elected Church of Christ president. And he could have said, I have no clue how many Christians there are across the land. And I have no clue what they're doing. And also this idea of people could have sided up with David Lipscomb about the piano that he also wouldn't associate with on something else. That whole scene of 1906 could have absolutely, in that regard, could have been avoided.
Pacifism, slavery.
Yeah, loads of stuff that he did not, and someone says, well, he passed it over to J.W. Shepard. He did not have to do that. And J.W. Shepard did not have to then play ball with the Census Bureau.
And when it came down to the Newbern trials, which is where the government got involved in saying who gets property, he didn't want to go to that trial, but he was deposed and had to. So he didn't want to be, and you find that in
Christian
the Christian Scholar. So David Lipscomb, on the one hand, didn't want to participate. The government, basically, when you're deposed, you're going to have to do it.
Yeah.
You know, you're brought in. He could have done the same thing, said, I don't want to be the one who makes the decision for the entire brotherhood unilaterally. I mean, you know, when Victor had something to say about him, I would have said I liked better Archbishop from the Church of Christ. What did he say?
I said president.
President.
I said, I'd like to know who elected him Church of Christ president. And then Victor said, well, he did it unilaterally. And that's right, Archbishop. So he could have easily explained that's not how things work. And this is where a moment where someone says, well, what difference would it make? I don't know.
Calhoun, to me, is the difference. 20 years later, you have Hal Laurie Calhoun, who is whatever you want to say with N.B. Hardeman, and he switches positions. That was happening everywhere as a result of the debates. How many debates are there? N.B. Hardeman has a debate on mechanical music. I mean, we could just go through our library and just, you know, categorize all these debates that were going on about mechanical music.
Yeah.
So it would have made a difference. It just, you know, the idea that it is solidified in our government. Who says?
I will say too, what you're going to see in the Victor Knowles interview is once that happened, they all were left, Victor, his dad, and different people that they knew, they all were left with this whole fight happening on their left side that it has to do with inspiration. So if y'all will read James Bell's book called 42 Years on the Firing Line, he's going to talk about characters called either the Harding 5 or 7. And a collection of those guys didn't believe in inspiration of the Bible. That stuff didn't start happening for us until decades later.
Yeah.
And it was already in their lap. So, I mean, it's a conversation worth having, and I also think that it includes action that needs to be happening now. Do we want to be evangelistic? Do we want to take the message out there? And we've said this too, it doesn't seem like anybody's doing well right now. So something is going to have to change.
Well, Victor was very emotional about the idea of that battle that was going on to their left. They said that some of the best preachers, some of the best debaters actually left and just said, we're done with that. And they had to fight that for another, 1968 was the end of it when the disciples of Christ finally.
But it was happening in the 20s. They had a great big fight. In the 40s, they had another one. And then in the 60s, it was done. Like they were just...
So what would have been the difference if they had if Daniel Summer would have debated those people that were talking about the Bible's not inspired, the liberals on their left? Well, we know what would have happened. He decimated the individuals that he was debating out of sectarianism. So why would it not have been the case that the same thing would have happened? They just did not have them available. And so, you know, they fought that alone. Somebody might say, well, that's what they deserve because they had a piano.
Yeah, and so this, you know, I would like to get into your stuff, and this is the way that it goes too. Someone says, well, they didn't split. They, independent Christian churches, you know, they didn't split fast enough, and look what happened. And someone says, if we hadn't split from them, then look where we would be. And I'm saying, look where they are. Freed Hardeman has Pepperdine speakers. Harding has the same Pepperdine speakers and then some. Harding had Orpheus Hayward. So it's like, y'all are not doing any better, right? So this is the thing, too. We talk about Pepperdine. Jason Rollo said, all I know about Pepperdine is that it's a college in California. Well, look, if y'all even have a concept of being better than Pepperdine, you're not. Because you're having all that come in to the Freed Hardeman lectures. And, you know, there is no telling what could be unearthed. Like I'm saying, David Shannon taking the little RV over to Jeff Walling's Winterfest,
Yeah.
boy, there's just no telling. And so y'all are not, you're just like 5 miles back down the road, but you're catching up with them. People used to would have said, and I was telling you this about, I was listening to Jerry Rushford talk about Harding. He said, we're out here at Pepperdine. He said, we consider Harding, boy, conservative. And I just thought, I couldn't even make my head think in those terms. Not now, right?
Right.
And it's like, well, they're all just moving at a slower pace than everybody else. So that's where I would say when you start looking at some of those histories and you say, well, we would be where they are, and I would say, you are where they are.
Well, with the David Shannon thing being at Winterfest, you had students that were taking up for David Shannon, and they were saying, well, David Shannon didn't let us go in. We didn't get to go in. We stayed outside in the lobby. And you don't know what David Shannon did once he went inside, once he was involved. And you know those individuals touted that the president, and we're talking about Jeff Walling, who we said a moment ago was preaching a lesson where a woman is using mechanical music and she is doing the invitation for him. That's what was going on in the 90s. And you're talking about going where Jeff Walling is. Jeff Walling is what, church relation, whatever, at Pepperdine, and they've got mechanical music on campus now in a congregation, and the LGBTQ thing is just full blown. They don't even do Title IX. They don't even worry about it. And so that when you said what could be uncovered, it's there.
Well,
that's where y'all are.
Even too when you said about the students who said, well, David Shannon didn't let us go in. Isn't that an odd relationship?
Yes.
I'll come on campus. I'm not coming in. Well, how did those people feel about it? And I think, too, that's where I said to Victor in the interview, I said, you know me. I'm non-instrumental. And he said, oh, yeah. But that's like, could you imagine if we showed up, it's, called Peace on Earth Ministries, and then it's also, the building is the Don DeWelt Prayer Center. Can you imagine if we got on the parking lot with Victor and said, I'm not coming in there?
Yeah.
Which is what they're doing.
Yeah.
We're coming in, we're going to have the conversation, and it's going to be good. And that's my thing.
Well, I do worry about you, Caleb, just from the standpoint of there is one area here where I think people are going to attack you, and it's not that difficult as far as to find. I think we've covered enough that anybody should be able to see that you're not just going in there and acting like everything's okay. We are talking about painful stuff. How many times did he break down? Very emotional.
Numerous.
Very emotional.
And the one thing too, someone will say, well, he talked about his mom and he talked about his dad. He did. But then that moment when I said, y'all didn't hear our best preachers and we didn't hear yours, and he said, it breaks my heart to this day. And it's like, well, those people are not his mom and dad, and I think he feels for these different crowds. So
he did the same thing when he talked about Archie Word's heart of thunder. No, what it was. How did he term that? Something tears.
Heart of thunder. No, you're right. Voice of thunder, heart of tears.
Okay, let's listen to this segment.
Let's sing a song that appeals to the heart. We had 5 people come forward the first service and 2 more the second service. And I'm not saying it's just because we sang that song, but I think that song helped. Because music can do things that preaching, I won't say preaching can't, but music touches
Let
a
me
different...
give backstory to that. He said that he was holding a evangelistic meeting, supposedly, and he wanted to know what the invitation song was. And the guy didn't even know what an invitation song was. And that's where they are. And then he tells what happened after he preached, which he's going to be preaching evangelistic.
Victor is,
right.
Heart of the heart.
Well, one thing they said about Archie was he doesn't just preach the gospel, he sings the gospel.
Yeah, and Don DeWelt the same.
Right, so there's certainly a reason why God wanted the music to be incorporated.
Yes.
Well, I read this book because you told me to.
Okay.
Without telling me to.
Okay.
You talked about it in one of your books, and then I got it. James DeForest Merch wrote the book, Cooperation Without Compromise, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but there's a note in there, this is all happening about in the 40s, and I could not believe it, that even in the 1940s, James DeForest Merch said people were viewing evangelism as a thing of the past.
Yes.
So for people right now, as we talk about, we'll get into your work, Archie's work, people hear us and they'll say, well, that's all in the past. Yeah, but that's what they said in 1940.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they've always been saying, it worked back then, it won't work now.
Well, can you believe that? We didn't say that, did we?
Well, the line about God wanted the music in there?
No.
Okay.
The 1940s, in the 1940s, they were saying that won't work.
Right. We haven't gotten on that. No.
And the things that did work in the 1940s, it's really unbelievable. The church grew just an explosion, and people were saying that stuff don't work. And now we hear that all the time. We hear people telling us, they actually tell us it's against the law in Dallas to do what we do. Y'all are just totally outside reality. Did you think that was a repeat, or was that something new?
Well, how do you mean?
Well, you're going to end up saying something that's going to be controversial.
Oh, I thought we already had that moment.
God wants people to go to heaven. That's why he sent Jesus, and he sent us to preach Jesus, because God has not ordained us to wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ.
Yes.
Evangelism.
All the way through. So now here's a point, and I did it this way on purpose. I think right now everybody, just us talking, everyone they love hearing about Archie Word. Mm-hmm. But there's going to come a moment where they're going to read Archie's book, your book of Archie, and they're going to say, oh, I'm done. And they're going to find out that he used the piano in worship. And then it's going to go away.
Yeah.
And Victor, I will tell you, and I've told this to plenty of people, anybody who would look at all the work that Archie did and dismiss him over one thing, I put it back on all these brethren who do zero evangelism, but they also don't worship with the piano. Well, if that one thing undid Archie Word, then they better get ready.
Okay. What I wanted to say again, and I'm not picking on Gary Summers, it's just it is what it is. I was having a discussion with him. I've been associated with Gary Summers for years, and we were talking about people that won't actually uphold sound doctrine. And he just, the statement was, he's been involved with David Brown for years and years and years, Doug McClish, and he just said, these people don't have the love of Christ in them. And my response was, people who do not evangelize do not have the love of Christ in them either. That statement was, if you're not following and keeping up with liberalism and, upholding sound doctrine in congregations, that's just that one thing. You don't have the love of Christ. You're not going to heaven with that. Back to that. Folk that don't evangelize, that's one thing is going to keep you out of heaven as well. And when we're talking about Archie Word, you just have to hear the interview,
right?
Because you will not believe, I just call it antics, the things that they did, and the people that obeyed, and the situations that they were involved in. It is absolutely no different as far than the pioneer preachers that they're going to uphold.
Right.
And for
the people who would say, well, that stuff don't work, well, how many people have to be converted before it gets categorized as working? Like, hey, but this is effective.
Yeah.
I mean, Archie Word taught a lot of people. And and it's like, Archie Word gets to be this, in the conversation, centerpiece. Victor taught a lot of people. And guys who were with, like, the Atumwa brethren, he said about Burton Barber was a fantastic debater, and it's just like, there's no telling, what they were doing.
He debated Ketracide, and Ketracide never debated that question again.
Yeah, and so, just all that, when you said about that, I mean, you covered that one, if they were listening a moment ago, and I said about that line where I said, God clearly intended for music to be involved. So we say to people all the time who would call what does the Bible say, and they would say, how come y'all don't have music in y'all's church? And we would say, I don't have a church. But then number two, singing is music. And what you said too about J.D. Tant, James A. Harding, they traveled with their own song leader. Why? Because when the preaching has been finished and we're still working on the heart, who wants to hear an awfully led song? Nobody. And you actually were in a tent where you told y'all need to get a new song leader. Yeah. Is that not right?
Yes.
What am I just going to suffer through this bad singing? So of course, singing is music and it works on the heart. And so when someone says, well, Caleb just, let that one go. No.
Who traveled with Tillett?
Or Tillett S. Tedley traveled with Foy Wallace. So Foy Wallace would preach. And then when Foy would get done, Tillett S. Tedley would get up and he would lead Glorified Millions Are Singing It Now, talking about going to heaven. Foy would stop a mid-song. He'd give another little bit of exhortation, and then he would say, sing on, Brother Tedley. And they worked together, singing and preaching. And it worked on the heart.
One of the things that Barber said in his debate is he said that these brethren cannot do without mechanical music. And maybe I'm getting this wrong. it might have been Ketraside that said that to him, and then he returned to Ketraside. He said, y'all can't do without these sectarian people in your songbook. All these songs written by sectarian people, but the reason I was thinking about that, because I was going to say, I don't know who this Tilly is. Look in your songbook. Yeah. How many songs in the songbook are written by him? And as you say, these individuals were evangelistic minded to the point where we're bringing our song leader with us. Yeah. We're not going to take a chance that you're going to pour cold water on the moment where we're singing praise and
working on the heart of man.
Absolutely. So,
well, you tell me, how much more do you have?
I'm satisfied that we're done.
Well, let's do one more and we'll tease.
Okay.
Could you? I think it might be here. Well, no, that was it. Where we said that one thing. Mm-hmm. So when I said about Archie Word, the one thing in the piano, right? The one thing. And I say back on everybody else who doesn't do any evangelism. Well, if we're talking about one things.
Friend who lives in.
This is Mac Deaver. Mac, his debate is what's next in the line of interviews. Mm-hmm. His interview is what's next in line, and listen to what he says.
I remember after he died, and I remember Brother Warren saying this, and I feel the same way. He said, there's got to be some place for grace. He wasn't an adulterer.
Right.
He was a good, decent, God-fearing, helpful individual all of his life.
Brother Warren was saying that about James Bales.
Yes. Yeah. He wanted, just like all of us do when a friend passes away, that have done so much good and lived a righteous life. You know, we all make logical mistakes, somewhere, some more consequential than others.
And the next words out of Mac's mouth are, but I want to see him in glory. So a lot of people would hear him and say, boy, he just said about James Bales that one thing. So it's like if you have a problem when you hear the Victor interview, because I said one thing, well, you're going to have a problem when Mac says one thing. And on and on. So, and I have to say this too.
Do you have more books from anybody in your library than James Bales?
Probably not.
Because he wrote so many excellent books.
Because when you say that and I say probably not, it's thinking of how many books Foy has. I mean, those would be the two most. Foy Wallace and James Bales.
And then Rubble Shelley.
Yeah.
In his earlier 20 years, 25. Yeah.
So, you know, and that's has been a consistent theme throughout all the interviews is we have these conversations and I have to ask, you know, was it the case that some people just didn't like some other people and we just got rid of them? Which, you know, I've asked you that question a lot about Mac, like what was going on back then. And there's a lot of that stuff that goes in and someone says, well, nobody knows anything about that. Well, what we get to do is say, I'm not going to be that way. You know, I'm not going to just basically say, well, I don't like them and I'm going to start hunting for stuff to get rid of them. I said that to Steve Wolfgang. I said, I don't like this stuff where somebody says, I don't know who that is, I don't care about him. I said, I don't like this business where someone says, I just don't care about him. And I say the same thing to Victor. How are we acting like God doesn't love these people because we say, I don't know who they are, therefore I don't care about them? So it will be coming up tomorrow night, and tomorrow night at 8 o'clock. And hopefully it is, like I tell Victor in the interview, his interview was the hardest one for me. It was a whole separate world that did not revolve around the Gospel Advocate. It didn't revolve around Firm Foundation. They had the Christian Standard, and they had the Restoration Herald. And just like how Gospel Advocate folk didn't read Mission Magazine, they didn't read The Disciple. It's just and they were fighting it. And they had all this stuff going on. And I think that it will help people know their neighbor, and I think it will help them know themselves.
I wish that Garland Elkins were still alive, because Garland Elkins actually preached in Roanoke, Salem, Virginia, and now we know that Victor preached in Galax, which is just really close when you get up there on top of the mountain.
Right.
And Archie Word preached over there as well, and Don DeWelt preached in Danville.
Yeah.
I would wonder what he would have to say about whether or not he knew these individuals. I'm almost 100% sure that he would know Victor. Yeah.
Well, I've said before that some people make suggestions about, well, you ought to interview them, and maybe I'll say no. But you might give me a suggestion, and I might say that's a good idea. But at the same time, y'all could tell some people, hey, you might think about letting Caleb Robertson interview you, and they might have a perspective that's worthwhile, and I might be open to that.
Well, B.B. James was up here, and that's Dub McClish's father-in-law. It's just unbelievable, the amount of people. And what is the preacher at Carnes? His dad
Higginbotham
is just up in Parkersburg.
Yeah.
And, I knew all of those brethren, and it's like, this is just, it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to watch the church. Are we going to watch it turn into the community church? Literally.
In a lot of places, I think so. And there's no telling. Somebody says, well, we might just turn the ship. Well, I say we better get busy doing it if we're going to do it. Okay. We love y'all. And different people who would argue with us, I love you. Different people would argue with us, we love them too. And if we want to, we have to disagree, and we try to do it without being disagreeable. And we're happy that people want to participate in conversation. And at the end of the day, we do want to win souls. And we hope that's what you want to do. God bless you. Keep asking, what does the Bible say?
Tune in tomorrow night.
8 o'clock.